Did you notice it also? I keep looking around and nobody's there anymore. Not physically gone. I mean, their bodies are still present, but they're absent in every other way. Last week, I was sitting in a restaurant with my family. It was full, a lot of food on the tables, and other people and families are sitting together. Not a single person was looking up. They were not talking with each other. One couple hadn't even touched their plates. Both of them were scrolling on their phones. At the bar, there was a man, alone, and he never once lifted his eyes. The room was full and completely empty at the same time. And I want to be honest with you right from the start. In that restaurant, I noticed something. Not as a judgment, but the recognition that something is off with all of us. I've been coaching professionals now for 3 years, and most of my clients are between 40 and 55. These are usually people who have built something real: careers, families, a somehow successful life. And almost without exception, somewhere in our conversation, the smartphone comes up. Not really as a complaint. It's more something like a confession. Do you know how I spend my mornings? I wake up at 5 and I don't touch the phone until I start to work at 8. That's 3 hours, preparing breakfast for the kids, taking the dogs for a walk and feeding them, silence, watching the light change at dawn. The same thing when I go for a run or for a walk. I leave the phone at home. Well, my wife is not so happy with that in case something happens, but I prefer it that way. And in these runs, this is where I actually think and where my ideas come up. And I'm not talking about the shallow thinking that happens when you're consuming. After a while, it becomes really deep. The real thoughts start to come up, the ones that need empty space to form. I don't want to tell you that to impress you or something. I'm telling you this because I wasn't always like that. I experienced it personally, what lives in the gap when the phone isn't there to fill it. And I know what it costs to not reach for it. Now, I have the feeling that something is shifting in our modern world. People seem to start to understand the consequences of always being connected and available. A recent study said that around half of the Americans say they are actively trying to disconnect. Dumb phones are coming up and becoming the new status symbol. There's an entire movement of people going deliberately and proudly offline. They don't do this to reject technology. These are usually people who build their careers on connectivity and are now quietly stepping back from it. Why do you think that happens? Our society as a whole is now starting to feel what my clients have been telling me privately already. That something in this constant connection is costing them something. They cannot name exactly what, but they feel it is there. And they understand that it is something important. So here's what I want to tell you today. And I need you to stay with me because it goes somewhere most of the digital detox conversation never reaches. The phone, your phone, is not the problem. The phone is actually the solution. The solution to a problem we are not really aware of, or we are not willing to name it. But the real problem is this. Most of us have developed a quiet terror of our own interior life. Silence. Of the question that only forms when there is nothing left to look at. About being completely present. That means you have to become actually available to your own experience. And this presence has become at least uncomfortable for a lot of people. And our phone is extraordinarily good at making sure you never have to go there. As a matter of fact, in a very precise psychological sense, it is a shadow avoidance device. And that word, the shadow, is where we have to start to understand this phenomena. Carl Jung spent decades studying what he called the shadow. The shadow is simply the parts of yourself you decided not to look at. Your unlived ambitions, the grief that never actually became grief, and also the questions about meaning that felt inappropriate to ask while you were building a career and raised children. The shadow is the version of yourself that you stored away somewhere in your life with the promise, or maybe it was a hope, that you would come back to it later. Well, later is now. Especially for us people in midlife, the shadow starts knocking. It has something to say and it wants to be heard more persistent. You might feel it as restlessness, but you don't know what it is or where it is coming from. You know these evenings that end with 2 hours of scrolling and a vague feeling of having wasted something important. So Jung called the work of confronting and ultimately accepting and integrating the shadow individuation. That is the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, rather than who you pretend to be for someone else. And Jung individuation midlife is not a therapy concept. It is the very specific psychological task of the second half of life. And it's a lifelong journey or a process. And your smartphone, in this context, is not a distraction. It is a mechanism for postponing that confrontation indefinitely. So the crisis isn't your attention span. It's midlife presence, the capacity to be available to your own life, which the scroll on social media has been quietly eroding, often for years. One of my clients, I call him an engineer, which he is, described his evenings to me in our first session. He said, "I scroll until I can sleep." So I asked him, "What are you scrolling away from?" And he answered, "Nothing, I'm just bored." Being bored. Do you sometimes scroll away from being bored? A few weeks later, I asked him to sit with me in silence for 5 minutes during our session. Just to sit and do nothing. He lasted 90 seconds. He told me, "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with myself." And he said it with a kind of embarrassment. But that sentence was the first honest thing he had said about his interior life in a long time. He didn't use the phone for entertainment. It was a lid to hide something that's sitting below. And this something slowly started to come up, to surface. And it wasn't boredom. It was the question, is this the life I actually wanted? And that, my friend, is the beginning of shadow work, in its most basic form. The scroll is not only a feature to keep you consuming. It is specifically designed to make sure that that question doesn't come up. Now, if some of that lands for you, first of all, that's great, and thank you. And you can be sure you're not alone with that. I can assure you that I also sometimes catch myself behaving the very same way. When I have to do something uncomfortable, for example, if I want to avoid a discussion or to make a decision, I pick up my phone. Not to call anyone, also not to look anything up, just because I'm used to this reaction. It's almost an instinct. And what can I say? It helps, at least in these moments. And it's the same impulse that I feel in situations of uncomfort that I create deliberately, like on a long run or during a fast. It is this moment when the discomfort shows up and my ego wants to escape and get back into the comfort. So this is actually a very human reaction. Maybe not normal, but it became all our pattern. And I admit it, I cannot always avoid it. And the goal is also not to suppress it completely. What I do, or what I try to do, is just notice what I'm doing. I recognize it as flight. And that allows me to understand the impulse and react accordingly. And that half second, this catch, the recognition, is what shadow work midlife professionals actually need to develop. Because it's not about willpower. You cannot force it. And you also don't need a week of digital detox. You just need the ability to notice the flight reflex before it completes. So Nietzsche, I'm always coming back to Nietzsche, I think he was saying so many right things. He wrote about something he called the last man. And the last man does not suffer. He doesn't take risk, he doesn't create, and he doesn't ask difficult questions. He's comfortable, entertained, and spiritually inert. He blinks, that's Nietzsche's word, in permanent, contented smallness. And Nietzsche said, the greatest danger is not suffering. The greatest danger is the life that successfully avoids it. Because what gets avoided alongside the suffering is also the meaning. And your phone gives you the exit without the return. the relief without anything changing. And over time you stop noticing there was ever a different way. That is the last man. And today he has a smartphone. And a lot of people I talk with are somewhere on that path without knowing it. Let me tell you another client story. She decided to do a 48-hour digital fast. No phone, no laptop, no television. Just for 2 days. And she described the first 6 hours as the most uncomfortable experience of her adult life. Not because the fear of missing something important, because of the silence. Thoughts and ideas she hadn't had in years about her wrong decisions, about a relationship she finished too quickly. And this is exactly what Jung described. Boredom is not the problem. Boredom is the threshold. Because what lives on the other side of boredom is the unconscious. And for shadow work midlife professionals specifically, people who have spent decades being productive, being useful, being permanently on, that unconscious has been accumulating for a long time. And your phone helped you to keep it all in the basement, out of reach. And it did a great job. So the lady, my client, she completed the 48 hours. The second day was quieter, she said. Not comfortable, but quieter. She told me something started coming through, and she didn't know what to do with it yet. But she could hear it and feel it. Now, before we continue, I want you to sit with something. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Think about the last time you reached for your phone, not because you needed something, but because something was uncomfortable. Just locate it. What were you about to feel before you escaped? That question is where your work is. Now, I understand we live in a connected world and we all depend on social media and all the other features and apps of our phones. And they do, of course, have very useful aspects. And the goal is not to avoid it completely. I don't think that's even possible. It's more to try to use them more consciously and not as an escape. And here's a simple solution. Create one recurring window every day where the phone is simply not an option. It can be in the morning, like for myself, or during lunch, or before you go to bed. Just make it a habit. 3 hours before work when I am unavailable to the device. This is where I stay in contact with myself, where I give space to things I would otherwise suppress. The second move is learning to catch the flight reflex. And it's really this half second before you open the app. And that is trainable. That is a recognition you can learn. Try it, for example, in the bus or in a waiting room, where everybody else is head down on their phones. And instead of doing the same, just look at the other people. What do you see? So every time you notice it, you have a brief window to ask, what was I about to avoid? And the third move, the one that matters most and takes the longest, is beginning the actual work underneath. Understanding what specifically is in your basement. What questions get stored away. What your shadow actually has been trying to say. You ask yourself, why do I feel empty at 40? There you find the honest answer. You don't need the latest productivity system. You need a real conversation with the parts of yourself that your ambition version puts aside. So the people in that restaurant last week, they were not shallow. They were also not weak. They were, in all likelihood, doing what most of us do. Managing the pressure of an interior life that has been asking for attention for a long time. And again, the phone didn't create this. The phone just made the avoidance faster. And it made it available at every moment. The shadow, the unlived life, the questions that don't resolve, they were always there. Jung said, what you don't make conscious will come to you as fate. And I've watched that happen many times. Because sooner or later, the unasked question finds its way out. The only real choice you have is whether you go looking for it or you wait for it to come looking for you. So if something of this landed and you want a concrete first step, the Career Archetype Test takes about 10 minutes. It is built specifically to surface the psychological pattern underneath the professional identity you have constructed. Because the first step back from the scroll is knowing what you're actually avoiding. You find the link below. It's free and worth your time. Aside that, take your next walk without the phone. Stand in the discomfort a few minutes longer than feels comfortable. And see what comes. I'll see you in the next video.